Welcome back to the Pacific Office Automation Postgame Scoreboard Show. It feels like it was the number one topic of Northwest sports talk conversation all week. It was the Oregon offensive line. They got, I wouldn't say they got pushed around against Boise, but they had some surprising blown coverages, some issues giving Gabriel the time he needed to hit some of his targets, and a lot of armchair quarterbacking, or at least armchair O-line coaching this week. I know we talked about it on our show Primetime. It's Ryan Buckley here with Will Ortner and Jordan Schultz. Will, the O-line was your wheelhouse, and when we heard this this exchange between Dusty Hera and Pancho Laloulu after the game, you're like, that's everything right there. So first, I want to listen to that exchange, and then I want to get your thoughts on what the Oregon O-line did today.
Pancho, what a heck of a performance this offensive line puts out on the field today. Playing center, you moved over from the guard where you've been starting the first couple of games. What clicked for you guys up front?
Obviously, we've been crafting on the things that, where we needed some areas to fix, especially the penalties and stuff, and like some technique and fundamental stuff. This week we went back to the basics. We say, hey, we're going to go back to the basics, start to, work on the hands, on our feet, and like chasing the ball and stuff, and try to eliminate negative plays. That was something Coach Lanning said through this week of one of our big things that us as an offensive unit and an offensive line, that if we can eliminate those negative plays and those penalties, we can have big plays and scores like we just had today.
It always did seem like through the first couple of weeks it was the correctable errors. But when you guys are assessing that as a group, you guys are a position group where 5 guys have to work as one. How is that growth kind of amplified over the first 3 weeks of the season?
Yeah, obviously, the first 2 weeks, we didn't play up to par and up to our standard, as an offensive line or as a unit. But this week we kind of, like we said, we're going to go back to the basics. And as of like me, when they told me I was going to be the center this week, I took that initiative to be that leader, especially being the young dude out of the whole line, but to be that leader for the guys, try to get them and gel together and let them know like, hey, we gotta play up to our standard, and we just got to go back to the basics and just play with great technique, great hands, and great feet.
Yeah, it's stuff like that where Pancho's talking about we had to be on the same page. We had to be moving together. We had to get back to the basics. We had to stop trying to do too much. Just do your job. And I know it gets to that old adage of like, well, Bill Belichick says this, and the only, written slogan they have on their wall in the Patriots facility when Bill Belichick was there was do your job. But at some point, it does come down to just do your job. Don't try and make the special play. Get everyone on the same page. And it felt like Pancho, at least the last 6 quarters where he's really taken over that center role, he's done that. He's made sure guys are moving together. And if you are wrong, you're all wrong together. So that way, at least you know what you're trying to do. I felt like Oregon did a great job, too, of getting onto linebackers this week. It felt like the last couple weeks, they weren't getting to that second level. They were getting stuck in double teams. Sometimes they were going the wrong way. If a polar was coming across, he was getting picked off because someone was getting pushed back because they were getting hit in a spot where they weren't expecting to, or they were just flat out losing a one-on-one battle. And so it felt like finally, you had everyone on the same page, moving as one, and it felt like everyone finally had that determination of, I'm going to get my job done, not I hope I get my job done. And that's what it felt like the first couple weeks.
So you reference everyone getting on the same page and playing as one, and I completely get that importance. But also there were some people who needed to improve individually in what they were doing. Who did you see make strides from last week to this week individually on that line?
Well, I'm always going to lean on Pancho because he is playing the most difficult position, I believe, on that offensive line. You are the person who is responsible for setting the protection. You are the person who is responsible for setting who the play side A-gap defender is, and that's going to determine the count that the offensive line has. But I also want to talk about Connerly. I felt like he finally had that game where there were no stupid mistakes. Like, I felt like against Idaho,
that group had 0 penalties today.
Right, and against Idaho, it's, Connerly takes a bad set because, this is an inferior opponent. I don't have to be as precise with my technique. So then he gets beat in a one-on-one matchup. Or against Boise State, you're going on a big, long drive for a touchdown, and I'm not going to make sure that my head is in my center's hip. That's a simple focus penalty. It's not jumping off sides. In this game, Everyone was on the same page. No one jumped off sides. There wasn't a bad snap that came from the center position. And then at left tackle, when you needed to get an outside reach so that Jordan James could hit the edge, you got the outside reach. When you needed to drive block someone, it got done. And when you had to take on a pass rush from Oregon, because Oregon State still brought a lot of fire zones at Dillon Gabriel, that offensive line stood tall, and I really feel like at left tackle with Connor Lee, he stood the most tall, where I felt like a lot of his issues were self-inflicted in the first 2 weeks, and they finally weren't there this week.
Can I chime in really quickly with a question just on kind of the personnel and how we saw Struthers at the left guard position, and thankfully Poncho back at center, which that's where the line seems to be best with Poncho is at center. Can you explain the school of thought, Will, as to like why it took them 3 games to get to that point? I get you want to give Pickard a shot, but I just wonder why moving your most talented lineman off that position is a positive in Oregon's mind for the first 2 games. Obviously, they're not doing it anymore, but I'm wondering why we even got to this point or how.
Well, without being there at actual practice, my assumption would be you think that the backup center is better than the backup guard, because Poncho was still playing, right? Poncho's playing that right guard position. It wasn't like he was out. And I think going into this year, the assumption was that Bedford was going to be your center.
Yeah.
And so it made sense for Poncho to be at right guard because you want your best 5 out there. So then the problem is when you have that injury at center, well, Pickard's been playing center and he's been in your system for multiple years. That's what worked with Alex Forsythe. That's what worked with JPJ. Well, we'll just move him there, and then we can keep Poncho at right, and then there's the least amount of movement possible. Because a lot of people will look at O-line play and just go, well, if you can play right guard, you can play left, and it's just not the same. Does it happen? Yes. And
well, you don't want to, to steal an old phrase, you don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul. Like, you don't want to, if you have a good guy at a good position, just because he can do the other, you don't want to sacrifice the one that he's good at.
Right. Well, and I'm not here to just totally, blame everything on Pickard, because it wasn't just on him. But it does feel like now you have a more cohesive unit. And I understand why they originally went with him at center. It makes sense. Hey, I have to move the least amount of people around. Everyone gets to kind of play their same spots. We're going to be okay. You also have to remember, Poncho's young. Most starting centers start out at right guard or left guard, and then you move inside. And so I think also there's a little bit of a hesitation of, we have a young guy. He hasn't gotten a ton of time on the offensive line, especially at that center spot. Maybe that might be too much for him to handle right away. And so I think they went with what offensive line unit they thought would work the best at the time. And as real bullets start flying, it's a lot different than a practice where you can, hey, check, I need help here. Or, your focus is just, sometimes you get too keyed up. Sometimes you miss things. Sometimes you go whiteboard and all of a sudden you forget exactly what you were supposed to do. So I feel like they went with the group that they thought would be the most successful, and then they weren't afraid to pivot once they realized that group wasn't working. And so that's also the sign of a good coaching staff, of being able to, hey, we tried this thing. We made sure it didn't work before we made the adjustment.
Yeah, you don't abandon it until you know.
We made the right adjustment, and it completely changed how this offense has moved.
So we've talked about how this line kept Dillon Gabriel upright and clean all day. They did a really nice job just keeping him protected. Not only no sacks, but very few hurries or even pressures. The run game has been outstanding. They averaged 7.5 yards a carry today. Jordan James goes for 12 carries for 86 yards, 7.2 for him. Obviously, Gabriel rips off the big run. But what is working well, or at least started working well and consistently for this O-line and just the run game group today? How much of it's the running backs? Essentially making their reads right? How much is the O-line being in the right spot? How much is all of that? Because I feel like at times against Idaho, against Boise State, when you were wanting to lean on that run game, you weren't necessarily able to. It was a little bit hit and miss. Today, it felt like they got whatever they needed when they needed it. What did you see in that regard from that perspective of the game?
Well, I saw 2 things. I saw everyone being on the same page when it came to zone. Now, the problem with zone is there's a couple different ways to run it, but the main way that most teams like to run it is if it's zone right, it's a cylinder step right. So basically everyone on the offensive line is taking a step to the right, and then you surge. If there's a guy in your right side gap, you're going to take him. If he's not in your right side gap, you're going to move up to the linebacker. That's the simplest way for me to explain it. The reason why you need a center keeping everyone on point is he's going to make the determination of who the play side A-gap defender is. That person is going to be the 0. The 0 gets blocked by the center. And then you count it out. 1, 2, and 3. 3 gets blocked by tight ends or wide receivers. 2s get blocked by the tackles. 1s get blocked by the guards. And then if they do any gap exchanges or stunts or twists, then you just pick up who happens to be in your gap. 1 could become 2, 2 could become 1, and vice versa. If the 3 looks like he's about to make a play for 2 or less, they're going to push the call, and then that moves everything over 1. It's very complicated, and you have to be able to do that all while almost not even talking at different times. You just all have to see that. Mm-hmm. And so if there's confusion at left tackle about where the point might even be set, you're going to go to the wrong guy because you think you're going to your 2 at the linebacker, but really the point's been moved, and so now you're missing out on that tackle. The other big addition that I saw, Dylan Gabriel adding into the +1 run game. And that meant that Oregon State had to stay home on Dylan Gabriel, and they couldn't commit 6 or 7 into the box.
It does feel like it's such a big difference when just the threat of that is there, especially when you show it early.
And once they did that, that allowed that run game to really be more even numbers between the O-line and tight ends versus the defense. And now you have Jordan James running free, and you have Noah Whittington running free, and they were actually making guys miss and not getting tackled by shoestring tackles. I was very, very impressed with the growth, and now you have to assume that growth will only continue. The interesting thing will be, now that you have the bye week, and we've seen that Matthew Bedford is back. He was working with the 2s.
He was off the injury report pregame.
Do you go back to the original lineup where Bedford moves to center and you move Poncho back to right guard? Or do you stick with this group because it's the hot hand? Time will only tell.